Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Oxford Business Insights podcast. And I'm delighted to say this morning I'm joined by Matthew Walls, who's the CEO of GENinCode, which blends science and strategy to help fight heart disease amongst many other applications. So we'll be talking about global diagnostics, genetic testing, and what the NHS might be able to learn from US and other healthcare systems. So welcome, Matthew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. No, it's great to be here. Good morning to you.
Well, I always like to find out a little bit about where our guests sort of started their journey. So, how did you get into science in the first place? Was this something you had a passion for when you were very young, or did it evolve a little bit later?
Well, I guess like many other people, you have things that you do at school that you enjoy, but I never thought that I would pursue a career in science. But I did enjoy the sciences at school, but then found that the first role I had was involved more on finance and in audit. So I worked as an accountant. And then very early on, I then started working with what was then called ICI. And ICI, for those people who perhaps not as aware of that company, was one of the biggest groups in the UK, certainly one of the old, I suppose you could say, colonial company. But then I went on from ICI to Zeneca to just before it became then AZ,
Yeah,
was the early part of my career.
excellent. And so you had a fairly wide-ranging career, starting in finance, moving into I think product development and so forth with those larger companies. But tell us a little bit about that transition. How did you get around to founding GENinCode before we get into exactly what it does? But the journey is interesting.
So moving on quite some distance. So this is now 6, 7 years ago. As you might expect, your career brings you into contact with a lot of good people over that time. And a close friend of mine, David Evans, had mentioned that there was a company in Spain, Ferra Pharmaceuticals, who'd been they'd launched what's called a statin polypill, um, a particularly successful drug therapy for lipid lowering treatment. And they'd launched it in the early 2000s. And during that period, they'd also had a dabble at building out diagnostics of heart disease. But as they'd been a pharmaceutical company, it hadn't really taken off in the way they expected. So he introduced me to the then CEO, and we got to know each other really well. And then September, October 2018, we acquired two companies, one called GenDiag, the other called Ferra Encode, and we merged them to form GenIncode, and that was in the end of 2018. So, it's the beginning of I mean, not all startups are like that, but in this instance, this was a good one because it had the foundations of something that was particularly leading in the field science-wise, but hadn't really commercialized effectively. And that's really the journey we've been on for the last 6, 7 years.
And would you say that that's what, given your sort of finance background, is that one of your strengths generally, not just with GENinCode, in terms of that you can take interesting scientific or pharmaceutical products and commercialize them?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably fair to say that I've spent nearly all my career working 50-50 between finance, investment,
Right.
and technology and science. And it's pretty much 50-50. You never lose sight of the paymaster, let's say, which is usually the investor.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you never lose sight of making sure that the business is delivering.
Yeah.
So, I like to believe there's a happy medium, but it tends to be the way the ebb and flow of financial reporting and business expectation. You'll tend to kind of run one side heavy and then quickly come back to the other to return. So, but overall, it's about a 50-50 balance, I would say.
Excellent. Okay. Well, now I think that we haven't delved into exactly what GENinCode actually prime mission is in life, and I would also be interested in terms of when you set it up, how different is what you're doing today, 5 or 6 years later, from what you were envisaging in late 2018?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing about business and when you're involved with, especially technology businesses, is it's never a linear path.
Yeah.
It's always erratic. But part of the skill of that is making sure that when it is erratic, you tend to, or I certainly try to, have things happening around us that If one isn't maybe coming as quickly, there are other things happening in the business that make it just as attractive. So they're getting, part of the early stages are to build out something that's robust as a business model, but making sure that it's got enough moving parts so that if one is slowing down, you're not wholly reliant on that. You have to have other irons in the fire.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, we set up the company in 2018. We raised a small amount of investment on the basis that what we wanted to do was the early years was generate some early revenues and get the company into it was still loss making. Most technology companies, science based, will always be loss making in the first few years. It's very difficult to get one that's heavily revenue generating. But from that, we started to deliver our first revenues. And since then, over the last 6, 7 years, every year the revenue has grown. Again, this year it will continue to grow, more significant than it was in the first few years. But yeah, it was all about making sure that financial delivery and that business model was beginning to return on what was really sound and well-developed science.
Yeah.
And it takes time. So like you said, I mean, it tends to be in the early days we raised a little amount of investment, but then in 2020 we raised 17 million on AIM. So
Yeah.
took the company onto the market. And again, that's something that you only do where you have a company that has all the hallmarks of something particularly exciting. It's not easy to do that in the early stages often with a company because it's yet to earn its spurs and move to that position where it can be seen to have significant investor attraction and potential. So we moved it on to AIM, and then again since then the markets have got particularly difficult in the past few years. So even though the company we've grown, if you looked at the share price, you'd see quite a different outlook in terms of the share price. And that's mainly the market pushing back on, let's say, small technology companies, which have gone to some extent out of favor.
Yeah.
The market's often cyclical. And during that period, we've continued to grow and strengthen. And again, like I say, we'll do the same this year. So that's been able, that process, that delivery, provided you're delivering, the market will afford you some flex around ensuring that, well, this is good technology, it's starting to deliver. And then all of the publications, the collaborations, and all the things we've done over the last 6, 7 years further support that process.
Excellent. Okay, and you see, how do you take a little bit of a look forward? How do you see the markets evolving? Are they coming back round to more sort of the type of products you're developing with GENinCode, or is it still going to be a tough market?
Well, I think so. The market's one thing, and then if you like, the industry and the way that that operates is slightly different. But if you take healthcare, which is the domain
Yeah.
which we work in, the big thing that's happening, certainly in healthcare and medicine, is probably for the first time, mainly since the advent of cracking of the genome and gene code since 2000, the millennium. What's now beginning to happen? It started initially in oncology was that we were able to use genetics to get an insight into future risk of
Yeah.
an individual. Most people will be familiar with cancer and oncology and BRCA and some of the more familiar mutations that people will have come across. They tend to be what we call more single point mutations, single genes with a known mutation or what gives rise to then whether it's a disease diagnosis or whether it goes on to become a congenital issue. But in our instance, what we deal with is polygenics, so multiple genes. And as a company, that's something we've become particularly skilled at because it's not just a simple find the gene within the DNA. It's then a case of, in our instance, multiple genes for which you then what we call risk score
Yeah.
using algorithms and then provide that as an insight to the likely risk of an individual suffering with a disease. And in our instance, that's heart disease.
Okay, and so most of your focus is cardiovascular in terms of your focus as a product. Could it be broadened out from that, or is that just the area you think is the most fruitful, or is it something specific to cardiovascular that your product can address?
So it can certainly be broadened, that's for
Yeah.
sure. And in the future, and what's now happening is increasingly those companies that have an ability to work with, very complex genetic gathering, and then on top of that, risk scoring, you can apply it. Now, of course, this is part of the, again, back to small companies and building them. You have to
Yeah.
focus very carefully on an area that you can see as yielding value rather than spread yourself thinly across a lot of exciting areas, which will generate value, but will take an awful lot longer. So that's again back to the focus around what we do. We tend to be focused in heart disease, although in the last 2 years, 3 years, we acquired a company called Abcodia in 2022, 23, focused in the area of ovarian cancer. And
Okay.
that's interesting because it links back to BRCA,
Right.
the BRCA gene. So you're identifying women at high risk of ovarian cancer by virtue of their BRCA mutation. And what we have is an ability to now track them, again, all around prevention and using our technology to identify those women most at risk for, and therefore a more aggressive treatment to avoid the and restrict or reduce the onset of cancer.
Excellent. And so, who are kind of, I can understand the application. So who are your sort of direct customers in terms of that you supply to your products and services? Is it sort of health institutions? Is it other large pharma companies? How does that work? What's your sort of route to the end user?
So for me, it's always best to make sure that whoever you're working with, they have a full understanding of what you
Right.
do. So in the very early instances, as you might imagine, it's completely new as a technology, completely new as a domain, polygenics.
Yeah.
So you're tending to work with, I like to focus with the key opinion leaders in the field. So they're
Yeah.
the top physicians in their field who understand what it is we're doing, can then get a grasp on how it could be effective and the clinical utility of what we do. And then they start to apply it. So it tends to start in small physician key opinion leader based approaches, but the key opinion leader is typically part of a community of
Yeah.
physicians who are usually globally leading, and then part of an institution, and then perhaps part of a healthcare system. So I like to start it, if you like, that route and then the root and branch process, because that way you're building on a solid foundation. And once the physician starts using it and gets the value from it, they'll then talk within their peer group and it starts to then
Yeah.
spread.
Okay. And so, sort of ultimately, would that be going to sort of from the physician to hopefully that they would take it into larger health networks, large hospitals? Is that the sort of the network that
Yeah,
you agree?
it does. It does. And then occasionally you'll get a bigger one like the NHS,
Yeah.
which is a much bigger beast, and tends to have the policies driven more centrally, tends to. But that can be, a double-edged sword. Whilst on one hand it looks like it's a big market opportunity
Yeah.
and it can look to be quite attractive, it equally has so many people at the financial trough trying to seek to get funding that it can slow things down. So you can often, you're there with many other people who are trying to bid for that business, not necessarily in polygenics, but simply just for the
Yeah.
purse of
Yeah.
what's
Absolutely.
available,
Competing for
which
budget.
means which means it's difficult for the NHS to do those things.
Okay. And we might come back on and ask you sort of some more thoughts on from a UK centric point of view of how the NHS might speed up deployment of some of these things. But coming back in terms of your own expansion as a business, I think you're doing a lot of work in the US. It's clearly a product presumably that could be completely global in terms of its application. I know it's easy to say, and there's a lot of different healthcare systems to work through. But how do you see that sort of expansion? And also, I can imagine the data exchange side of it is really important, sort of to enable you to grow and for other people to understand its application. So, could you talk a little bit about how you grow that?
Yeah, having got our heads around, we talked about polygenics. You tend to think, well, when you've got it, surely isn't it a case of rolling it out globally? It sounds so simple. But the first thing you realize is that each nation globally is completely different in terms of its healthcare approach.
Yeah,
It perhaps comes from, history and culture. but you therefore have each group, each nation thinking in terms of what it prioritizes for health and how it approaches that. So the way we operate is the systems, the technology, and the products are all common. But then locally, when we then take them into the clinic and for medical use, the operations are very specific then to the local communities, hospitals, and institutions within that nation. And it's the same for data. That's
Yeah.
patient data, whether it be privacy of the data, whether it be good data practices, cybersecurity, all of those things are handled at a national level. So you tend to have to then form yourself with your common approach to those local systems. And that takes time.
Yeah.
So therefore we focus in Europe, UK, and the US.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I would say Europe has, because of the heritage of where we acquired the companies from Spain, Spain has certainly traditionally been our biggest revenue generator. Then in the last few years, couple of years, we've started to then bring the UK and the NHS online. So
Hmm.
that's now growing quickly. And then finally, the slowest, if you like, but the one that's got the most potential is the US.
Right.
Now, the US is interesting because unlike the NHS, where you have, let's say, one large customer in the UK, you have a disparate group of
Yeah.
healthcare areas in the US. But what's interesting is they have one central regulator, and that's the FDA. So where they lose out, let's say in some of the disparate makeup, they make up for it in terms of a big regulator, which equally is a big obstacle to moving your product into market. So a lot of work to be done then with people like the FDA to get your product properly engaged in the US market.
I believe you have some experience with the FDA, which must be helpful with a smaller company. If you didn't have that, it might be more of a challenge. Is that fair?
It's tricky. It's tricky. I mean, yeah, this will be my fifth
Right.
approval in the last 40 years, I would say. So yeah, I mean, having worked with them a lot on and off over the years, things have moved on considerably in the last 5, 10 years. Yeah, you need to know how to navigate that process. It's not a simple process to move through.
Okay. And so, I mean, from the way you're talking, I understand you've got strong Spanish roots. You're dealing with the NHS, UK, Europe seems positive. US is obviously potentially the largest market, but presumably beyond that, once you've cracked the US, does it become easier to do others, or is it still that every different health system you've still got to go through that process of
It
then
moves.
dealing with this?
No, it will be. It will move much. It's already starting. I mean, in increasingly, what happens is it's a little bit, the analogy of lighting lots of little fires,
Right.
and you let things move. Because a lot of it is education.
Yeah.
Even though we all understand what a gene is, we all understand that some genes perhaps have coding, and this is
Yeah.
part of GENinCode, coding for mutations. What you then have to explain is and work through is that each of those genes plays a different role, a particular part. And in the case of heart disease, whether it's inflammation, whether it's plaque buildup in the arteries,
Right.
whether it's the way in which the patient metabolizes cholesterol, there are so many aspects to what lead to
Yeah.
the onset of heart disease. So a lot of what we do is the analysis and the linking from what we call the pathology of
Yeah.
what a gene does to what it actually then means in symptom terms at a clinical level. And once you can do that, that mechanism of action from how a gene operates to its clinical impact, you can then start to look at not only diagnosing it effectively, but importantly, precisely treating it.
Yeah.
And that's where we spend nearly all our time educating, advising, and working through that process with physicians.
Okay. And how do you target them, or do they are they now coming to you in terms of in
Bit of
marketing
both.
terms? Is it more inbound or outbound now? I mean, I can imagine you
It,
have to have
it,
more
that's
outbound.
it's probably at that point, like you said, it's all let's say inbound from us to them in the
Yeah.
early stages of the company, and then as the technology becomes more engaged, more accepted, more
Right.
adopted, then it becomes more outbound from them because
Yeah.
they're peer groups and it becomes part of the guidelines for use in terms of
Yeah.
risk assessment for heart disease. At which point, yeah, I mean, it becomes less educational and more operational, let's
Yeah.
say, and you're then into a much faster growth process.
Okay. That's great. You mentioned ovarian cancer possibly being a next target area. How do you look at sort of general in terms of product development in going into new areas? I know clearly you've got a lot of work to do to maximise your market position with the cardiovascular area. But do you take it? Is it opportunistic? Is it just something, or do you actually have a clear plan of the product development path over the next, I don't know, 3 to 5 years or something like that?
It tends to be quite when you're dealing with, again, back to focus a technology. Whilst you can see that it may be applicable to other disease areas because of what it can do, each disease area requires such depth of understanding,
Yeah,
and especially for the size we are at the moment, like you say, it's important we focus on that cardiovascular piece. So the product development and extension from where we are is mainly in the areas we've already got a core competence.
yeah,
But within that, again, it's so um, large, the area. So just coming back to heart disease is the number one killer on earth.
yeah.
It has been for the last 100 years. And even now in today's world, we typically classify it based on the symptoms you have at a point in time. So
Right,
only when those symptoms appear
right.
do, do we start to look at treating it. So this
Yeah,
is all about, the way that classically, traditionally, heart disease has been treated. So to get ahead of that, we need to start looking at how we can identify what genes will have an impact to you in your life. Maybe not initially when you're in the early stages of life, maybe not in teenage or even into your early adult years, but later in life, those genes start to adjust and change together with environment and so on. And as a result of that, what we do is we're involved in, if you like, predictive risk,
yeah.
the that an individual will have in the future, and therefore it's preventable, it's prevention. So our whole process as a company is focused on prevention of
Right.
disease. And in the case of heart disease, given it's traditionally been mainly clinically assessed, we're now bringing genetics to that process.
Okay, that's really interesting. Just in terms of, as you said, the genome was sort of decoded roughly 25 years ago. An awful lot of work and development has gone on, but clearly that's only, I don't know, a third of a typical lifespan, or even less. I mean, can the science predict exactly how somebody born in 2000 might be at the age of 50, or is that something we just got to learn as we go along?
No, it's a good question. So part of the reason why it's complex, what we do is we work with large population data sets.
Right.
So coming back to the US, our one of our key partners is a group called Kaiser Permanente.
Yeah.
They're one of the largest healthcare organizations globally. And they, by good fortune, together with people like the UK Biobank, have access to hundreds of thousands of patients who fit the criteria we're looking
Yeah.
for heart disease. So we follow those patients over as long a period as we've got data, clinical data for them. And we use the DNA from those patients to then start to look at how effective we can be at predicting the onset of heart disease. So, and then we come back to the publication. So in the last 2 years, we've started to publish on data sets of 14 years
Right.
follow-up. So that allows us to, for patients who've been tracked for 14 years, and we, for example, at the beginning of that 14-year period, we identified this patient was at high risk. We then track them over a 14-year period and see what's happened.
Yeah.
Now, that therefore gives us really good real world data from which to assess the strength of our products and our testing. And yeah, so we've not only started to publish, but in the last few years now, we publish at the main conferences that
Yeah.
set the guidelines for um, risk assessment for heart disease. So that's been a big part. It's not only, so these are 63,000 patients over 14 years, which gives a very strong
Yeah.
insight into how effective your test is at predicting heart disease. So that's where we spend a lot of time on that side, working with partners. Some are not as big as those data sets, so they're multi-ethnic. So, not only European ancestry in genetic
Yeah.
terms, but Latino, South Asian, Hispanic, African American, all of those subgroups of the population we need to test. We need to make sure that the product and the test that we've built is effective at identifying across those multi-ethnic communities.
Okay. And just coming back, just a very broad question about the coming back to the UK and the NHS. I mean, I've always had this feeling, and maybe it's just giving away my market research roots, but a look at the UK as you've got a 65, 70 million population, a relatively tight geographic area that is usually a very good place to sort of market and test things. I'm not talking just in the pharma or science community, I'm just talking generally. Is the NHS, it seems to me it should have a fantastic set of data to be able to use and develop these things. It should be absolutely world class. Can I ask a simple question? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, well, half of it, let's say, Nick, is you've got to want to do what we've just talked about. So
Right.
let's give the NHS top marks for ambition.
Yeah.
Okay. Where it falls down is on the delivery, in my view.
Yeah.
And and I've spent my nearly all my career in and out of the NHS at different levels, working with them in different ways. So, like you get a pretty good insight from an outsider's perspective
Yeah.
of what it feels like to work with the NHS. So I think, yeah, the ambition is high, the delivery is often lacking, and then we come back to, well, why is it lacking? And it can be a lot of different reasons. And more recently, the one that we tend to be encountering is, it's very difficult when you've got a priority of waiting lists, ambulance
Yeah.
response times, and the things that mean a lot to, let's say, general public, the social media at large. When we get into the slightly more technical aspect of identifying people in the population who are going to die of a heart attack, which is as important because
Yeah.
that's just so you're clear, that's where most death in the UK happens.
Yeah.
Mortality happens from heart disease.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit longer a sentence and a bit more difficult to explain than a waiting list or an
Yeah.
ambulance response time. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm very much for trying to address all of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again, back to the budget and how it's split and how it works is tricky, and
Yeah.
especially in the current world we live in. So I suspect that's part of it. I do think that I'm hoping that the new government with their new thought processes, hopefully they're going to bring a new um, verve, a bit of kind of kick in their step into trying to do. West Streeting appears to be trying to do things in the right way. So let's hope and
Yeah.
give them a chance to succeed.
Well, thanks for that perspective. It's probably a slightly unfair question as the NHS are one of your your target markets, but I appreciate your insight on that. Okay. In terms of taking you as a sort of a business leader more than the specifics of your product, tell us a little bit. What's it like leading a global healthcare company? You've obviously worked in some very big corporations before and had very big jobs in those, but you're now leading. How big roughly is your team of currently?
We have 35, 38 people in the company.
Yeah.
We've steadily grown over the last 6, 7 years. And those individuals, especially when the company is young and small, it's so important to get the absolute right people to
Yeah.
work in that team. The culture, the people I work with, I'm really fortunate to have a team around me who work incredibly closely with me. All of them are highly industrious. We work long hours, but they all believe in what we're
Yeah.
doing. And that, in the early days, that's so important because without that structure, it's very difficult to build.
Absolutely, but with your locations, yeah, for 38 people, but spread, how many in the UK? Just rough figures. How do you split
So
your team?
we so of that 38 people, there are only about 10 people in the UK out of
Right.
that. And what we've done as a company, as you might expect, I mean, 35, 38 people over um, Europe, the UK, and the US is pretty slim in terms of coverage. So what we do, I mean, and it's been the advance, whilst it was very difficult of around COVID times, but it forced us all to use Teams and Zoom.
Yeah.
all of the time. So we use it religiously, day in, day out,
Right.
hour in, hour out. We're never off it. Everybody uses it pretty much to, whether it's a coffee break and somebody wants to catch up with someone, we can do it quickly over Teams. So every aspect of the way the company runs, and we couldn't run without it, is done digitally
Yeah.
using Teams and Zoom. And for that matter, it's not only effective for the internal operation of the company, all are I mean, I spend probably 1 to 2 weeks on average a month in the US, but it allows me to almost feel as though I'm there most of the time because the rest of the time I'm talking to the US via Zoom or
Yeah.
Teams. So we use it religiously. It's become part of everything we do as a company, and without it, we couldn't operate in the way that we do.
Excellent. I mean, I can see just one downside from you. You're in Italy at the moment. It's quite a bit of a time difference depending what part of the state, somewhere between 6, 7 hours and 9 hours. So, do you ever switch off?
Do you know, well, I mean, we try. I try to. I mean, like everybody else in life, you have to find some downtime here and there. You're trying to get. I tend to find that downtime is useful for sleep.
Yes.
So that's what I'll tend to do most of the time when I get chance. But no, it's long days when Europe are up early, and the US on the West Coast, kind of even it's the end of the day here in Europe by the time the West Coast come
Yeah.
online. And often, we're busy on the West Coast. That's the area that we've seen most growth in the last year or two
Yeah.
in the US. So yeah, long days, but exciting nonetheless.
Excellent. And just what sort of in terms of that team, what sort of people? I'm not asking you to lay out a recruitment sort of plan exactly, but what sort of people will you be bringing in as you grow that people? Is it more technical people or is it more sales marketing? How do you look at that?
A little bit of, I mean, the sales and marketing has certainly grown in the last couple of years. That so each area, those three, Europe, UK, US, has its own sales team, let's say, in business development. But the other key areas are the bioinformatics, so AI,
Right.
cyber side of what we do is a big area of growth for us. So at the technical level, that's probably a third of the group technically are involved on that. We've then got, and the other third is around the lab. So we have a lab in London, in Hammersmith,
Right.
one in Barcelona, one in Germany, and one in Irvine in California. So they're the four labs that are internal to the company.
Right.
Um, and that's another third. And then the final third is probably what I'd call operational, customer service and so
Right.
on. So that's the way we're divided up. I see all of those areas, all four, in total, all of them will grow commensurate with the growth in the company.
Right.
Um, but equally, the other thing that's important, coming back to the 38 people, when all our systems have been built so that they're international in structure. So we have a single system that operates in each nation, so that the data and the information is held locally. But it's harmonized so that as we bring the products through, those same products are used in Spain, Italy, Europe,
Right.
Germany, in the UK, and in the US, but done, if you like, individually or siloed by servers and infrastructure that then controls the data locally. So we've built that out now, and that's become part of the way in which we expand the
Right.
offering. And it's not something that is visible, it's something that's invisible and digital, but
Yeah.
it's allowing us to scale the company effectively. So that's perhaps coming back to the, albeit 35, 38 people is slim, we rely heavily on that digital aspect of growth. And as
Yeah.
we grow, whilst the revenues will increase, the headcount growth will still grow, but not at the same level as the ability to digitally reach through and cover off those markets using
Yeah.
a much more efficient and effective way of delivering our products and tests.
Excellent. And so, look, just to sort of wrap up the business side here, what would success look like in that three to 5 years? Yeah, I get the message of focus to sort of like dominate cardiovascular, which is probably the biggest single market for you. You mentioned ovarian cancer, but what would you like to think about the company looks like? What does it look like in 3 to 5 years' time?
I think it will continue to grow around the areas of prevention in each of
Yeah,
those nations because they're all coming down that same channel of understanding that if we can prevent disease, we can allow people to live a richer, more informed life. So that will be a big feature. I'd expect to see more engagement in Europe, more engagement in the UK with the NHS, and more engagement in the US. And for now, that is the 3 year, 5 year
yeah,
plan. What will happen as a result of those, let's say, bigger fires then by nation? They will in their own right become that those three groups perhaps are the globally leading groups
yeah.
for heart disease, and they will be then other areas of the world will look to those as being the barometer for change at a global level. So no, keep doing what we're doing, keep the
Yeah.
focus, ensure that we the revenues, and obviously with the revenues growing, then the losses drop back, so we have reducing losses, and then the company moves into profitability, and that's our next big piece to move to now. Let's get to the company into profitability and continue to grow. It's difficult to do what we do. The technology requires not only a lot of investment, but a lot of systems expertise
Yeah.
and competencies in individuals. So I think yeah, we intend to grow that. With the other thing that will be a feature of that process will be collaborations with bigger groups.
Yeah.
So to expand nationally and internationally, we'll be doing that with partner groups. So that will be a feature of the next year or so. You'll start to see that come into focus as well, and that will further accelerate the process of growth.
Excellent. And just, I'm asking you this on a slightly, I'm not necessarily focusing just on GENinCode. I'm just interested in your view. You often get the belief that sort of the UK is quite good at setting up innovative technology companies and perhaps getting them to a certain size, but not necessarily so good. Quite often get bought out by I don't, larger corporations, very often US-based corporations. Is there anything? Would you have a view on that in terms of just general, not necessarily looking to sort of pry into GENinCode's sort of investment trajectory? Would you have a view on that? Can the UK do more to help companies get beyond the start, the sort of medium size and become truly dominant in that?
Yeah, I think it can certainly do that. The UK could be much more energized to take advantage of those technology companies that are world class.
Yeah,
Definitely can do more there. And part of the reason for that is that those companies that will become world class, that will grow and dominate a particular domain, will be the way in which Rachel Reeves generates that much more for the exchequer.
yeah,
Now, if we let them go, especially if we let them go early at low value, it may well feel that those investors who had enough in it early on and were there at the beginning got a reasonable payday. But the truth is the nation's lost.
yeah,
And for me, that you're absolutely right. We need to be much more acute and smarter about that approach. That's one. But then the other piece of this is, and this is something that is tricky because we're not like this in the UK, is for most of my career, whereas I can raise £1 in the UK, I can go to the US and raise £10 for the
yeah,
equivalent technology. So it's almost a tenfold increase in the way that they throw capital and investment at technology.
yeah,
And as a result of that, when they see a company and a product and a technology breaking, that £10, $10 worth of investment comes over the hill
yeah,
and it steals the guys who can only operate in the $1 or
yeah.
£1
No, I get
process.
that.
And it's tricky. It's tricky. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. The roots of who we are in the UK, and and I count all four parts of the UK, and for that matter, Ireland too, Southern Ireland. We have a real strength in an ability to invent
Yeah,
science and deliver at the early stage the proof of concept. But we certainly have an inability to exercise and exploit it properly, both commercially and development on an international basis. That's not to say there are a few, one or two here and there that have managed it, but they are few and far between.
yeah. No, thank you for that perspective. So look, really appreciate taking your time out because I know you're having a break at the moment, but you're back on full on later later in the week. But really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about that. we've learned from sort of your background, not necessarily starting in finance, big corporate, but starting out a fascinating company that's going to turn genetics, DNA into life-saving diagnostic advantage for the benefit of everybody in the long term. So I certainly wish you luck and success, every success in doing that. I'm sure you're going to achieve it. And thank you for taking the time. If people, obviously, there's your website. We'll put on that. Is there any other way if people want to find out what GENinCode is doing? Is LinkedIn website? What's the best way of finding out generally? Not necessarily for it could be for a scientist, but for somebody who's got general interest in what you're doing.
We're very approachable, Nick. I
Yeah,
mean, it's easy to, if somebody can send you an email and ask you a question, or they can send you a CV and say, would this work? And you can quickly respond back. So very approachable. The company's, info@genincode.com,
yeah.
.co.uk, all of those things. And again, locally in the areas of Europe. If anybody feels that they've got something that they can bring and add value to what we're doing, we'd love to hear from them. So that's the first point. But yeah, we tend to be quite selective when we're looking for roles. We know exactly what we need to fit that role, well, we hope we do. It's often a case of finding the right fit with people. So yeah, the more people who become aware of what we're doing and feel they can fit into that, we'd love to hear from them.
Thank you very much for your time, Matthew. Really enjoyed hearing about that journey, and I won't interrupt much more of your holiday. But I'll stop recording now. But thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Nick. Really good to speak with you. Thank you very much.